right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Cannabis Minority Report here by the National Cannabis Industry Association, the NCIA. We got a great episode here lined up for you today. I'm joined by our special co-host today, Chris Jackson, the vice chair of our board and the owner of the basketball league's Oakland County Pharaohs over there in Michigan. And we also are joined by a really special guest today, Mary Jane Oatman, the executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, as well as you'll find out, several other organizations that Mary Jane is very integral with. So we're going to jump first to some announcements from NCIA, and then Chris will take us into the news, and then we'll have an amazing conversation. I know it's going to be amazing with Mary Jane Oatman. It's always a great conversation with Mary Jane. And no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, I don't know. So, all right, here we go. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up today is from the NCIA side of things, we have the Equity Workshop Tour in New York, Detroit, and Chicago has been taking shape. It's solidifying. We are not yet officially announcing Detroit and Chicago, hopefully later this week, but we are announcing New York. It's going to be May 13th. That's a Saturday. It's looking like it'll be 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. We hope that you'll join us there if you're in New York. These workshops are designed to really build community, build a network, recognize that networks are national. The quote that I keep using is from Dr. Mila Marshall, who was on the show recently. And she said, look, people of color, we need to stop sleeping on the fact that our network is national. We need to really recognize the network is national and tap into that. The siloing that's been happening definitely harms and hurts us in being able to really build successful businesses and really find out what's going on. So yeah, thank you very much to our gold sponsors, Grow America Builders and Etain, our gold sponsors for New York, two companies that have been very actively engaged with NCIA for many years now. We also would like to thank our silver sponsors, Indiva Advisors, Canis Capital, the Mary Jane Consulting Group, Zenco, and Illinois Equity Staffing. So thank you very much to these companies for stepping up and saying, yes, we want to throw a little bit extra skin in the game to make sure that these workshops happen and that we can bring the equity community together in these different places to be able to create this connectivity and the synergy. So thank you very much. We also, a little bit of news from the NCIA. We had our second Global Majority Caucus on last Friday. Global Majority Caucus, for those of you that are not aware, is made up of our global majority, aka minority, leaders from across the organization, board members, committee leaders, committee members, our equity scholarship members who have become very actively engaged in leaders in the organization. And we meet once every 2 months to basically report out on what's going on in our different silos within the organization, all making efforts towards greater DEI within the organization and in the industry at large. So that was our second meeting that we had just the other day. It was very successful, really great to hear all the different things going on across the organization and starting breaking down silos within the NCIA. So let's see, one other thing I want to mention is thank you to Evergreen Market for stepping up and sponsoring our DEI delegation to Lobby Days in DC in May. So our DEI delegation is made up of several of our equity scholarship members who have been actively engaged in our committees, doing advocacy work, policy work, not only at the NCAA, but also in their local municipalities, local states. So really important to have these folks there in DC with us, weighing in on our talking points, weighing in on what's going on with our organization regarding safe banking and how to make that more equitable. So all these different pieces, again, thank you very much for Evergreen Market and everyone else that supported Lobby Days in general as well. Evergreen Market stepped up and said we want to support the DEI delegation specifically. So let's see, I think that's it for me. We got a couple great episodes coming up. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Bridget Williams and Natasha Delanoise Andrews. Natasha is the founder of the National Association of Black Cannabis Lawyers. Dr. Bridget Williams is a powerhouse in the cannabinoid medicine, cannabinoid science realm of things, part of our education committee here at NCI as well. And then she'll be followed up by Michael Diaz Rivera and Peter Sue. So with all that said, I'm going to switch gears and hand off here to Chris Jackson. Chris, recent guest on the show, I think the first guest of our new season and, vice chair. So here, Chris, let's bring it back to you. And what do you got for us today?
I appreciate you having me back again. I'm excited for the interview that we have today. Appreciate all of the work that's being done, but we'll dive into that a little bit here soon. So many things we could be talking about, so many things, always so many things. I was actually jealous because last week you covered this topic already, and it was unfortunate because I'm in that sports and entertainment space, right? And so if you'll indulge me for a minute, would love to just piggyback on the conversation you were having last week related to the NBA. It's still with the CBA and the moves that are being made to allow for not only player consumption in a variety of different ways, but also their ability to promote and invest in cannabis companies, which is huge, right? I think I was a guest in earlier seasons, and we kind of had this conversation. And when you have minor league systems, right? So our team exists in the TBL, which is the basketball league, which is a tier underneath the G League in terms of competition. What major league teams generally do is try new things out with minor league teams in a certain capacity to see, if it could translate, how it translates, what kinks they need to work out, things like that. And so if you remember me talking about our league, right? So part of when I was with the company Sticky at the time, right? We had the ability to actually start to put sponsorships and patches on our jersey from different cannabis companies. And then it was also taken out of the bylaws that you would be tested as a player for cannabis consumption. And I don't have any direct access to the NBA or anything like that. But I like to think that once they saw that it's not necessarily a detriment to the team, it shouts out to people like Al Harris at Viola and Calvin Johnson, Megatron at Primitive, to be specific. You've had a nucleus of former players that have come out and said, hey, we have been doing this for a long time now. Everybody else just needs to catch up for a litany of different reasons. And then the back channel to that is that you have other players who are currently playing that have an ability to monetize in ways that former players have an ability to monetize. And I've always believed that the way that legislation goes is based on professional sports because of what it means to America in general. And then obviously big industry like oil, gas, but in this case, big pharma. And so I think with NBA, MLB, soon to be probably the NHL and NFL as well, moving in one direction and big pharma calling for it at the same time, it bodes well for federal legislation to come into fruition. How quickly that happens or how that looks, I guess is a better way to put it, is to be determined. We might not like any of it as far as how it fleshes out at the end of the day. But when you got a major league like the NBA doing what it's doing for its players, I imagine that they know things that we probably don't have access to. So,
absolutely. No, I appreciate you sharing that, Chris. And when I attended the Pharaohs game last year, I got a picture of myself next to some of the promotional banners, which included the Sticky logo, and I took that, one, because I was at your basketball game, but two was also because that's historic right there. Seeing at a professional basketball game that Sticky logo, it really blew my mind, to be quite honest. That was it was quite a trip. So no, appreciate you sharing that. And as far as, I just want to remark on what you're saying about how it looks and whether we like it or not. That's why we're doing this work at the NCAA, right? Yeah. We're representing Main Street. We're representing social equity businesses. Like, we're like, hey, look, we got to figure out how to galvanize and work together so that as this happens, we have the right partnerships in place and we have a voice at the table. So, even if we're not the loudest or the most well-resourced as far as financially as, say, the pharmaceutical companies may be, the more that we can organize together and really be galvanizing hundreds and even thousands of businesses, I think that speaks well. So thanks for bringing that up, Chris. Absolutely.
Yeah. So now let me take it to a more regional context. This is big news coming out of Michigan this week for anybody that follows anything related to cannabis. And so it's a telltale. It's not great news for the industry, but hopefully we learn and grow from it. And there was the ex Speaker of the House, Rick Johnson, I believe at the time. So Michigan, during its medical phase, I don't know if many people know that Michigan for a long time had a medical market, a regulated medical market, whereas probably longer than some of the states that are more mature than we are, even in adult use. So in 2008, the Michigan medical marijuana market was established. Shortly after that, there was a board that basically consisted of 5 people that dictated whether or not you received a license or not, right? So problematic to begin with, first of all, because as far as I can tell, they were all at least the chairman of the board was appointed by the governor. So it wasn't like it was a democratic system or anything like that, right? Anyway, this system, this board existed for 10 years, abolished in 2019 by Gretchen Whitmer, which means that very likely that these folks influenced the way that our industry in Michigan looked then, but also continues to look now because of the head start that some businesses had access to, generally speaking. At any rate, some news just came down the pipeline from a litany of different sources that Rick Johnson, former chairman of this board, admitted to taking bribes from at least 2 companies and just taking a plea deal. The company owner also admitted to it, and there are 2 lobbyists who are also on the hook for this. So we're talking about public corruption at its finest. And what likely will happen is there will be other indictments coming down the pipeline, because if we're talking about folks taking a plea deal, it means that they're cooperating, right? So there are probably a lot of companies that are shitting their pants hoping that they don't get mentioned in this upcoming process. What's frustrating to me is that money and the influence of this board theoretically dictated what our market looks like. And it's shifting in some capacity. But in order, I mean, for instance, Calvin Johnson, Megatron, I'll bring him up to bring it full circle. He was on an episode of Cannabis not that long ago, last year. And this board actually denied him a license, him and his partner, Rob Sims, for parking tickets that were probably 7 to 8 years old or something like that. So if Megatron can't get a license from this board, an NFL Hall of Famer, to put it in perspective,
one of the top 2 wide receivers of all time.
Of all time,
right?
Easy, right?
Yeah.
What makes anyone else that's normal, that doesn't have the resources or the relationships or the connections? What makes them think that they may not have been targeted in a similar fashion? And while we're only calling out Rick Johnson because he was the chairman of the board, I'm not saying everyone on that board was corrupt or took money or bribes or anything like that, for the record. However, he likely had influence over decisions that were made, right? So whether or not they knew what they were a part of or not, it doesn't change the fact that our industry in Michigan looks a certain way because of bribery and public corruption, ultimately. Now, since then, the system has been streamlined in a way where it's far less, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not biased, right, in a lot of ways anymore. However, we can't say that history doesn't necessarily dictate. And the issue is that there won't be anything retroactively done, probably, to correct any of this. So you live with it and you be happy that some folks that got caught. But we got to get more creative about how we fix issues like this. More importantly, hopefully it's a telltale for other states that may be considering doing something similar to think otherwise and have a more streamlined process. So not great news. Well, great news in that public corruption is being exposed related to our industry. Not great news because it happened in Michigan, but it is what it is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that news with us, Chris. It reminds me of Florida and the frustration there, right? Because, okay, so they have this guy now, they slap him on the wrist, they send him to some white collar institution. If I'm not mistaken, his wife is still the CEO of the company that benefited the most from that. So, it's just kind of interesting to see how these things roll out. And to your point, okay, let's go ahead and slap 1 or 2 of these people on the wrist to take the deal. because they know they have enough against them that if they don't take the deal, they're going away for serious time. And then the people that benefited from all that situation get insulated and isolated from the fallout, and the industry continues to move forward as if it didn't happen. Other than now we can talk about it on shows like this or whatever else may be. But to your point, I think that things are tightening up everywhere. And this was stuff that happened during kind of a little bit more still Wild West-ish days. And
Yeah.
hopefully now we're going to start seeing that transparency is key. And a lot of these new institutions, these new agencies like OCM, New York, for example, operate with a lot of transparency relative to what was done in the past. So yeah, not the best news, but good news that it's coming out. So thanks, man. Did you have some businesses you wanted to highlight in the Michigan area before we push forward?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly. On the flip side, the positive things that are happening is, in other states as well, like Connecticut, and you got states like Pennsylvania, Maryland, right, that are making their transition. Minnesota having some conversations. So, shouts out to the folks that are actively including equity without having to be told to do so, right? And so in Detroit, finally, after that big fiasco, now there are businesses from social equity legacy applicants that are opening up. So more Black and brown ownership is happening as we speak in what is probably considered the blackest, or at least one of the blackest cities in America. And so businesses are starting to reflect its residents, right? The folks who live there, which is really important when you consider long-term just economic prosperity for communities at large. And so while there's conversation of corruption, there's also conversations of perseverance and ownership, which is really what we want to push. So shouts out to the folks that are opening up their dispensaries, provision centers here in Michigan.
Awesome. No, that's great news. Especially after all the delays and the pushbacks and the lawsuits, it's great news to hear that that's moving forward and happening. And what's the landscape going to look like in a couple of years? It'll look better for sure. So
hopefully.
that's awesome.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
we're working on it, right? We're working
hopefully.
on it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Still more work to do always. You can't stop and get complacent. So we have a great guest here today, somebody that has really taught me a lot over the last few years about how the indigenous cannabis and hemp landscape looks, especially relative to the rest of the industry that often really does not have any idea what's going on in the indigenous world, to be quite frank. I think that it's something that we've slept on for too long. We've tried at NCA to make sure that we are much more conscious about this. We got to work with Mary Jane a couple years ago in the Detroit conference that we did, actually, where Chris was a major assistant assisting of us there. Mary Jane, I mean there's so many accolades, right? There's so many different organizations you're part of, like whether it's you found the Tribal Hemp and Cannabis magazine, you found the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition. You are now the new executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, and you're also a board member of the Justice Foundation. I mean, basically, every time I see you, you're just doing tireless work. I see you all over the country. I follow you. I see everything you're doing to really make sure that the indigenous, dilemmas that exist in this industry that are unique and interesting and complex, which is why I think we also kind of push them to the side a lot of the times because it's already a complex industry. So I really appreciate you and everything you're doing. I know a lot of people do. Everybody I talk to is always like, yeah, Mary Jane is just on point. So Mary Jane, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really looking forward to this conversation and really helping some of our viewers understand a little bit more about what's going on in indigenous cannabis and hemp. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to join as a guest. I am a big fan of the National Cannabis Industry Association.
Awesome. That's great to hear. We're a big fan of you. So the first thing is just, wanted to ask you, before we get into all the industry side of things and the policy side of things, on a personal side of things, right? Because at the end of the day, cannabis is a very personal, relationship with the plant, right? So can you tell us about your relationship with the plant, right? I know it's central to the work that you do, and so it's something that really drives a lot of your passion. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. Well, I'm joining you all from the ancestral homelands of my people in the Nimipu territory, currently known as present-day Idaho. I really like to talk about my community and really lead from that position, because our creation story of the Nez Perce people includes the hemp rope, and our sacred sacrament with smoke as a healing tool, as a way of connecting, has been a way of our people's life, regardless of what sacred blends and herbs, are put together. Our people have always had a high value of that sacrament. And so it's really important to always, for me, recognize that this work is really rooted in the ancestors of our people, and reconnecting our contemporary Indigenous communities with those relationships of the past, is really, really why I'm so driven to do this work. So my relationship with the plant really is, part of honoring our ancestors and planning for future generations. And, while we are doing this work in unity, because that's really what I'm really honored to be a part of, is a lot of partnerships, a lot of networks, is that the Indigenous communities really have had a very strong subculture and underground since the war on drugs, since the war on this beautiful sister plant. And I come from a family that has always had a very high value, all puns intended, of this as a medicine that heals. My grandma went to federal prison for growing when I was a little girl. My mom, she was a cannabis user through all 6 of her pregnancies. We're all healthy, happy, contributing members of society. So I would also argue to say that, we've had that relationship, or that symbiosis with cannabis since in utero. So that's really where my start is there, Mike, is that it started, when my mother consciously chose to medicate herself and use cannabis to heal, and did so while she was pregnant. So, I mean, it's been a part of my DNA forever.
So along those lines, and I appreciate you sharing that perspective in that story. So along those lines, I'll be honest to say that I'm only starting to begin to understand tribal and indigenous cannabis policy. And I imagine, because a lot of folks live in silos and everyone has their own issues, that they probably don't understand it as well as they should either. And it's a very complex matter. So can you give us a general overview of what the state of affairs currently looks like for indigenous and tribal cannabis?
Well, it is complex, and I can, in Mike's opening, just reiterate that the complexity of tribes from one state to the next, regionally, and then the complexities of those state government relationships do make it a hard pill to swallow. It's like, the whole eating an elephant, where do you start? And that's really what I did, was just one bite at a time. I live in present day Idaho, but my reservation borders right next to Washington State. So while I was working on some of our tribal law and order code revisions and community work to move in that direction, the community will to move in the direction of passing proactive cannabis legislation, I made the decision to go and work at a dispensary in Washington State, so I could kind of learn the front end recreational retail side of things, learn what the nuances of the whole track and trace, seed to sale, all of the buzzwords of the industry. I wanted to just saturate that knowledge, and that's when I realized, holy cow, there's a lot of tribes in Washington that were already really active in the work that I was doing. I wasn't seeing a lot of farms coming out of tribal communities, but a lot of recreational retail stores, specifically in Washington. And that was kind of like my aha moment when I realized, okay, tribes are really stepping up here in Washington. what are they doing in other places? And so I just kind of started nerding out, starting a journal of who's doing what, where, and started doing that in 2018. 2019 founded the Indigenous Cannabis Industries, or Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, excuse me. And for me, education and advocacy is really where it's at. We're going to be in that space for a long time, really driven by data, policy, and research, so that our tribal communities could make informed decisions. And that's when I just kind of just took that 30,000 square foot view, state by state, trying to track which tribes were operational as an enterprise in retail, which ones were cultivating, and then decided to put it into a format that was palatable, and created a THC magazine. And in the centerfold of the magazine is the nation's first and only proprietary tribal nations cannabis dispensary and farm map, where we work to track and create a directory of all of the operations of tribes across the nation, as well as a catalog of all of the tribes that have been approved by the USDA to cultivate hemp.
Is this like first off, that's amazing background. That's good to know. I don't think I was familiar with that map myself even. Is this something that is common amongst tribes? Like, are a lot of tribes across the country participating in some capacity in whether it's cultivation or retail, or is this like, a minority of tribes? Like, what does it look like, the landscape?
Well, the landscape is still very much a minority, but we're seeing a big uptick with more networking between the tribes, conversations starting at that local community level and expanding out. But out of the 574 federally recognized tribes, less than 50 are operating cannabis enterprises. But with that being said, those tribes that are in cannabis are seeing such great success that they are creating secondary retail locations, or they are now working at creating fully vertically integrated facilities where they're also putting off shelf, because it's like Costco, they have their big brand, and then they have all of these other brands, and tribes really see that having their own farm, creating their own brand is really a niche market for them. But not enough, definitely not enough tribes exercising their sovereign authority in this area.
And to that point, are you within tribes, are you seeing tribal ownership collectively, or are you seeing individuals within the tribes decide to move into the cannabis space and represent on behalf of?
That's a really interesting question, because as we're, saw what happened in Washington state, it was primarily tribal enterprises moving forward with kind of almost of a corporate model of tribal business in cannabis. And now we're seeing some of those tribes retroactively amend their ordinances to allow their tribal members, the individuals, to apply for a license to cultivate under tribal law, instead of having to go through the processes of doing it with the state to become a permitted state cultivator. And then, you look over to the other side of the nation in New York, and you're seeing more of a model where they're crafting their codes and ordinances for the benefit of the people. They want to see the families that have persevered and kept this plant medicine, that have had a connection with it. They want to see those families also benefit. And so we're seeing everything in between. There are some tribes want nothing to do with plant touching, absolutely nothing, but they realize it's a viable economic opportunity for them to maybe open up their lands for leasing to other cannabis companies to come in. And then, of course, they're generating revenue from their taxing structure, plus leasing land, plus their ordinance fees, permitting, the regulatory structure. So there are tribes that are benefiting from cannabis, having the opportunity to create safe, quality access in their communities that is well regulated. And it's not even owned or operated by the tribe. So it's really interesting. It's like not a one size model fits all is our motto at the ICIA. until we see something that is that, that golden ring. It's honestly, it's in part and parcel, but we're more than anything just collecting a lot of the data on what the tribes are doing, and networking them with each other. And there was a conversation brought up earlier, about the bad actors, something that the ICIA is definitely concerned about, through our partnerships, having those conversations, not only about anti-monopoly, but bringing up some of the nuances of what happened in the early days of Indian gaming, and why there was the impetus to create the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act because of the gamesmanship that was happening in tribal communities. And there's definitely predatory situations happening in tribal cannabis. And our presence is unsettling and uncomfortable for the bad actors that are doing this in Indian country, because now they're seeing tribes up the ante, do higher levels of due diligence, or making sure that they are sourcing tribally owned and operated consulting companies to work with, or allies that have been vetted.
Okay. And when you say our presence, you're talking about the ICIA's presence, right?
Yes.
Okay.
The Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association.
Cool. Just making sure, because a lot of different moving parts here. And so, on this note, right, ICIA, looking to make sure that keeping the bad actors accountable, identifying the bad actors, doing research and what is going on, connecting the dots. Is a question I have here is, how does the ICIA, how does the tribal cannabis ecosystem interact with the rest of the ecosystem of cannabis companies, especially when it comes to states that maybe aren't legal yet, or are tribal cannabis companies only existing in states that are legal already? Like, how does this whole thing work, basically?
That's another great question. There's definitely some blending over into tribal communities where there's no legal form of cannabis in the state. Mostly on the exploratory side of things, tribes that are more progressive are trying to find ways that they can, craft their ordinances so that they can be, turnkey, so that they can be ready to go as soon as that opens up. I do know that there's, we just hosted a historic summit with the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. Our founders and a majority of our board members are from Wisconsin. There's no legal form of cannabis in Wisconsin. All of their laws around hemp do allow THC or hemp derived THC products. So there's not a lot of regulatory structure in Wisconsin, and a political will to move in that direction. The governor very supportive of moving forward with cannabis. Our Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association has had the opportunity with our leadership to sit down with Attorney General Call to discuss what it would look like for tribes to have the opportunity to engage in cannabis, exercising our sovereign authority. So more than anything, it's just, that early conversation, also with our tribes, to give them the tools and resources that they need to network with other tribal cannabis attorneys, because Wisconsin is very complex. It's a public law 280 state. Idaho, where I'm from, there are no tribes here working specifically on cannabis development. Like, there's no cultivation going on except for the, guerrilla family farms that have historically always happened. Aside from that, our tribes are working, they're doing their due diligence, they're working with their insurance companies, doing the risk management assessments, so that they can be ready. But because of the language that was crafted in the Cole-Wilkinson Memorandum. I'm really seeing more than anything tribes that are in states where there's no legal form. They are progressing very slowly. They're just having community conversation. They're revising their law and order codes, or they're crafting cannabis ordinances so that they can be ready. But nothing at that bold level where it's challenging the status quo.
So, okay, this is a good transition point, maybe. So, at the Reservation Economic Summit, you spoke on tribal hemp and cannabis. So, how was that received? And do you mind sharing a little bit about your experience as you try to spread the good word?
Yes, it was a wonderful summit. The National Center for American Indian Economic Development has been holding this convening for a while, and the cannabis conversation only came to the agenda because of our, emerging partnership with their organization and the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. That's really what our organization has been able to do, is be that partner that brings the conversation into the space so that they don't have to lead with it. And that's when I say they, some of our tribal organizations don't necessarily feel comfortable leading with cannabis as, one of their pillars, but they understand that it impacts health equity, it impacts housing issues, it impacts job and job policy issues and employment policy. So it has to be a conversation that we have. And so to be able to go into a forum like RES, I mean, we're talking like 4,000 tribal community members from across the nation that joined together for this convening. So it was a packed room. I anticipated that it would be because we're advancing a very complex conversation into one of the most notable tribal convenings that happens across Indian country, and being able to lead the conversation from the Indigenous perspective with trusted experts from across the nation. So that's really our strongest skill set. Is our founder and president, Rob Perro. He is the owner of Candigenous CBD in Wisconsin. So he is working towards branding, marketing, retail, cultivation in Wisconsin already on the CBD side, and sees that need to be able to educate the other tribal leaders, as an entrepreneur leading tribes into a safer space conversation. Our board of directors really is dynamic. I mean, we've got Marnie King. She's out of Hub International, serving to really advance that risk management conversation and bridge that gap with our cannabis division, cannabis management team. Colin Price, another one of our board members, he's a retired law enforcement officer and has really shifted the narrative in how we engage with people that are still very resistant with this conversation. We also have Fern Ori, who serves with OISTA and has really advanced the conversation around community financial development institutions and how tribal banking and our advocacy, as well as our lobbying efforts within the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury, are a lot stronger. And then, of course, our attorney, Samantha Skenendor, she's just always on her A game. And so we have the need for resources to be able to create a stronger federal lobbying side of what we do. We really, I think, have a good lay of the land just in general.
Yeah, so I think you read my mind with what I wanted to ask you next. You mentioned banking, and this is where I think there is intersection between what the social equity community in cannabis and the indigenous community in cannabis, where they intersect, because especially with CDFIs, I want to make sure I get the acronym right. Community Development Financial Institutions, These are mission-driven financial institutions that historically do serve low-income communities as well as minority communities, indigenous communities. And I know from actually reading some of the things that you put out there, this is a sector of businesses that do serve the indigenous population. So my reason for saying all this is that NCIA, one of our focuses is really the Safe Banking Act. And recently, the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition last year came out with an amazing white paper that showed 10 recommendations. One of those recommendations was to make sure that CDFIs are included in the language moving forward. It's something that our DEI delegation has actually advocated for within the organization here. And so my question for you really is just, how does this overlap? Is this a priority of ICIA? Is this something you all are looking at and working on? How does the whole banking ecosystem come into play with you all and CDFIs in particular?
Oh, it's super, super critical to be able to have clarity in the language for our tribal CDFIs. That's the hub for the loans, the grants, equity investments, the deposits, our credit unions. It's just like the core of economic sovereignty for tribes, and being able to have access in tribal communities to the lending services would be huge. But I think that even bigger than that is the technical assistance. Right now, a lot of our tribal communities have the opportunity to kind of create the templates, the boilerplate templates for what that could look like in cannabis. But the CDFIs are still in need of, I guess, more of this allyship with organizations like, the National Cannabis Industry Association, in partnership with the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, on data assessments. Like, we have the need to assess how many of our tribal CDFIs right now are working specifically in hemp lending. I mean, hemp is federally legal, and we still have a large amount of our CDFIs that are not touching hemp. So we know that they're not going to want to touch cannabis for a long time, even after it would be federally legal or safe banking. Then there's going to be a need for our tribal CDFIs to have technical assistance, crosswalk to what this looks like. But there are programs out there that are working, so we have to kind of reverse engineer that. One of those examples is the Oregon Native American Chamber received grant funding from the Portland seed funds. So now they have the opportunity to help create regenerative cannabis farming business plans for tribal and indigenous community members in the Portland metro area. So they're working on creating curriculum, the video tools and resources. And this is exciting because I see a little micro program like this that's created between a city program and a chamber of commerce, then being able to support and be replicated out in native CDFIs across the country that are not gonna feel comfortable developing those resources themselves because this conversation is still very taboo. And there's very clear direction that gaming and cannabis dollars cannot mix, cannot cross. So the tribes really want to make sure to proceed carefully, because there's always the notion out there that they could be jeopardizing their other federal funds, other federal grants that they receive. And so that's why we see less than 50 of the 574 federally recognized tribes, as those others have not figured out yet what that business structure looks like for them to create a cannabis enterprise, or they're just waiting. They're waiting for safe banking to pass, or they're waiting for their state to legalize, or they're waiting for federal legalization. There's always going to be those tribes that are, on the outside of the fishbowl, and they see those other tribes growing big, inside of the fishbowl, but they're going to wait for the permission. But that's not all tribes, and that's definitely not a majority of the tribes. But I do feel that if we got safe banking over the finish line with provisions for tribal banking, CDFIs, that would be the Pandora's box in Indian country.
Awesome. Oh, appreciate you sharing that breakdown. And it goes to show again why safe banking is a lot more than just simply being able to get a bank account, right? It's a big signal for a lot of institutions and a lot of institutions, whether they're lending institutions, banking institutions, to be able to step forward, technical assistance, even all these different pieces. So let's definitely make sure we connect offline and continue the conversation regarding as we get ready for going to DC with our talking points and lobby days and everything. So I think we're starting to come up against time here a little bit. We're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to come back for our Candid Quiz, our game segment that we run every week. And I think we have a couple other little tidbits of information we want to share regarding Mary Jane here once we get back from break. So Vince, our amazing producer, take us away for about 60 seconds.
Well, here at the National Cannabis Industry Association, we have proudly represented small businesses across the cannabis industry since 2010. We represent Main Street cannabis, not Wall Street cannabis. We have come so far in this fight to legalize cannabis that it seems that it's almost inevitable, and we're the ones making sure that as those rules are written, they favor small businesses, mom and pop operators, and Main Street cannabis, not Wall Street cannabis. In addition to making sure that your voice is heard at the federal level, being a member of NCIA also means building a vibrant community of small business owners within the cannabis space. Because we can always learn so much better by working together, learning from our mistakes and our successes, and building this industry together. So if you're interested in making sure that small businesses and Main Street cannabis has a seat at the table, be sure to join NCIA at thecannabisindustry.org.
All right, so we have our Candid Quiz today. We have our Candid Quiz. The way that this works, it's our game. It's a multiple choice game. Yeah, we have 2 questions for you. The goal is to get, of course, both of them. But if you don't get both, then let's see if we can get 50-50 out of these. Let's see. We're going to start here now. And as I mentioned, I do have a snippet of information that I want to share with everybody, but we've been holding off until the end to share about Mary Jane. I want to ask you about in a second here. The experience with. So the first question here, and these are provided by our awesome producer, Vince Chandler. Shout out to Vince, all the amazing work you do. 4 years now you've been producing the show. Really appreciate the hell out of you at NCAA and helping keep us honest in so many ways with making sure that DEI stays at the forefront. So and I don't say that lightly. I know that Vince, this is something you live, breathe, eat, sleep, everything. So appreciate you, man. All right, so let's see. Here's the first question. As research continues to be published, the medicinal uses of cannabis become increasingly more undeniable. What is one way that more and more experts recommend experiencing the benefits of the plant without producing the euphoric high associated with traditional consumption? So the question here is really, what is something that more and more experts are recommending if you want to basically experience the euphoric experience the benefits of the plant without the euphoria? So is it eating the plant raw, smelling the flowers while they grow, cross-pollinating while cultivating household herbs? It is impossible to interact with cannabis without getting high. So that's the 4th answer, right? Saying that that's not even a possibility. So eating the plant raw, smelling the flowers while they grow, cross-pollinating while cultivating household herbs, or it's simply an impossibility.
I would say taking the time to stop and smell the flowers.
That is an awesome answer. But let's see here. We got consuming raw cannabis does not cause the high feeling that one gets when smoking cannabis or consuming it via decarboxylated edibles. Studies have also shown that consuming raw cannabis has the potential to treat lupus, arthritis, and neurodegenerative diseases, help stimulate appetite and decrease nausea, prevent the spread of malignant prostate cancer cells, and prevent cell damage that can lead to serious illness and poor health. I would not have guessed this one myself by any means. I don't know if anybody here has ever tried eating it raw like that. It's not necessarily the best flavor. Yeah, exactly. It gets you over there, right?
Juicing, though. I imagine there's a lot of people that are juicing.
Ah, there you go. Okay, juicing, and Vince just put it in the chat there. Yep, juicing. So that's what it is. All right, juicing. That makes a lot more sense to me. Okay, see, Mary Jane, you actually kind of knew what we were talking about. Here you go. So, Chris, did you want to run the second question here?
You go ahead. Technical.
All right, I'll go ahead and take it here. So all right. So Mary Jane, know your history or be doomed to repeat it, right? As Chris mentioned earlier today on today's show. That's the old adage. And in an effort to remember our own history, let's go back more than 100 years to the start of cannabis prohibition. Federally, it began in 1911, Prohibition did. But what was the year of the first state bans for the plant? So, what was the year of the first state bans of cannabis? 1911, 1913, 1917, 1923.
Oh, I thought that the first state ban was the same as the first year of federal ban. My guess is 1911.
All right, so we're gonna go with here. I mean, and that's better guess than I would have necessarily. So, in 1913, California, Maine, Wyoming, and Indiana banned cannabis. 1915, Utah and Vermont followed with their own ban before being joined in 1917 by Colorado, when legislators make the use of cannabis cultivation of cannabis a misdemeanor. In 1923, Iowa, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont bans take effect, mirroring many of the first states. So the answer is 1913, California, Maine, and Wyoming, followed by Utah and Vermont, then Colorado, Iowa, Oregon, Washington, Vermont. The interesting thing there to me is so it is 1913, a couple years after the federal ban. The interesting thing is a lot of these states are states that we are familiar with being some of the first states to go ahead and legalize adult use. California, Colorado, Oregon, Vermont's on board here now. So, a lot to unpack there. We probably don't have time to get into what might be behind some of that. But I think that it's really interesting to look back on our history and recognize that these states, were not necessarily down with the cause from early on. So, So sorry, Mary Jane. It looks like you're 0 for 2, but that's an 0 for 2 with an asterisk, I think. Because you still show a higher knowledge than us at the show here about the questions in the first place. So so the other thing that I wanted to ask you about before we go here is I'll make sure I got it correct. All right, yes. So in 1997, homecoming queen of Miss Idaho. So Miss Idaho homecoming queen. And tell us about this. Like, I mean, I saw this and I was like, okay, wait a minute, here we go. So tell us about this experience. What does this mean?
Of course, even in senior in high school, as I was graduating, I was a cannabis user, and so I felt like I was really just posing going to this. First, I just went to the state competition, and I was just going because it was a scholarship competition and I planned on going to college and I just needed a little bit of extra flow. So I only entered it for like a check because we got some, we raised money for the sponsorships and we got some scholarship money out of it. I ended up winning the state competition and won a trip to Anaheim, California for the Miss Idaho Homecoming Queen competition. And then I was like, how am I going to go without my medicine? So I had a great mentor, AKA mom, and she was like, you're just going to take a couple of joints and you're going to put them in with a pack of cigarettes and then you'll be fine. And so I was doing all kinds of crazy stuff to go down there and represent the great state of Idaho. And I did. I went to the state competition. I had to rent a dad because my parents couldn't go with me. My mom had just had the oops baby. My baby brother Vance was just recently born when I had to go down to California for this competition. And you had to walk with the dad down that. Anyways, I did great at the national competition. I learned a lot, got a little bit of scholarship money, but on the very, very last night, I was like, oh, I got to sneak away. So I went down by the pool and I was over there smoking up and I hear voices and I hear giggling. I'm like, oh, shoot, and there were 4 other girls from, I don't want to name their states just to not throw them completely under the bus because you could probably look that information up. But 4 girls from 4 states come walking around the corner and they're like, oh my God, I knew it. So we kind of all had this camaraderie and we all on the very last night got to share that doobie that I smuggled in my Marlboro Light package. So I was always trying to figure out how to move, at a very, very young age.
Nice. That's awesome. That's a great story. The Marlboro Lights, the Oops Baby, the Rented Dad. I mean, the whole thing, right? The 4 other states. Now I want to know what the other 4 states were, just out of curiosity. But of course, we'll ask that offline. But no, thanks for sharing. That's awesome. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today as a co-host here today, and providing some of those takes on the news, man. Really, really good, insightful stuff. And, Mary Jane, always a pleasure. Like, really is to have these conversations with you. I'm glad you were able to join us, just really bringing this knowledge, this information. Thank you for really spelling a lot of these things out for us. As I mentioned earlier, this is stuff that I'm still learning. And so I'm putting my hat on while you're talking also, and really making sure that I understand, because this is important stuff when we go to DC. And as we continue our lobbying here from the NCIA, we need to make sure that we are respectful of and inclusive of the Indigenous perspective in cannabis. And this goes to everybody out there listening today, right? This is something that we need to keep moving forward. We can't talk about social equity. We can't talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion if we're ignoring the Indigenous population when it comes to this plant. So thank you so much for bringing everything here today. Let's see. I think we're right up against time. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we do head out?
Check us out at indigenouscannabis.org. Join our network. And that's really what it's about is, I've been bold and brave in this advocacy work, but we're building community, and there's 20 other Mary Janes out there. Unfortunately, they're not named Mary Jane, but what I mean, in each state, in each community, there are a lot of Indigenous community folks like me that have the passion, they have the knowledge, and they definitely have the ability to advocate for Indigenous communities. So that's what I love about this work, is that, we're coming out.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's a great way to end the show today. So we'll go ahead and call it a wrap. Thank you so much again, everybody that's listening and watching. Thank you so much. Make sure that if you're watching us live, you go ahead and you subscribe on Spotify as well, so that you get those notifications and you can help us share the show out there. And if you are not watching it live, then check in on Mondays, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We do the live video here, and you can join in the chat and interact and engage with us as well. So everybody have a great one. We'll talk soon. Next week, we got Natasha Delanoise Andrews and Dr. Bridget Williams. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much.
The Cannabis Minority Report is a production of the National Cannabis Industry Association. Hosted this week by Mike Lomuto and co-hosted by Chris Jackson. Our producers are Bethany Moore and Aaron Smith, and our executive producers are Vince Chandler and Mike Lomuto.